Hello, hello. Welcome to the Japan Zoomina. It's March 21st in San Diego and March 22nd in Tokyo, wherever you are. Ohayo gozaimasu. Good afternoon, good evening. I already told you that. I'm Ulrike Schaede, professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. So while the Zoom participants are still finding their seats, let me tell you just a little bit of background about us and what we're going to talk about today. So this finds you at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy, which is an international relations and public policy school at UC San Diego. More information about us is at gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center, and you can read up on us at jfit.ucsd.edu. And if you go there, you will find a way to sign up for upcoming Zoominars and watch past ones. And as many of you regulars know, our Zoominars are recorded. So you can go back and find links to past events at jfit/Zoominar. And today what that means, today what that means is if you're invited to type questions in the Q&A box during our event. If I were to read out your question, I will not refer to your last name, only your first name, so that your privacy is protected. We have a number of upcoming events, including John Bradford, who is ex-Navy and now researcher on the South China Sea. That's in 2 weeks from now. And then in mid-April, we have Laurel Shepard, who sails around Japan and does some nonprofit work. It's very, very cool. So I hope you can join us for those. Stay tuned, stay with us. All right, so today we're going to talk about marketing, and our guest, Andreas Dannenberg, has asked me to just maybe get you into the groove a little bit here. He's going to talk about this phenomenon called chin-don-ya. And I looked it up. It comes from chin chin don don. Yeah, so these are people who make a lot of noise when there is a new thing. They go chin chin don don. And what they're actually advertising is shinhatsubai. And everybody who's lived in Japan and seen a TV ad knows this term, right? So it basically just means new. So that's actually one, and Andreas will tell us all about this. That's actually a very important part of marketing in Japan. Then there are some other things about marketing in Japan that I find very interesting. We've all heard about sort of funny English that makes us laugh. This one is Pocari Sweat, which in and of itself is funny, but it also said sweat for dream. So maybe could be globalized. There are a lot of ads that feature important people like athletes in this case. And then there are some weirder things like these girls that look like Mickey Mouse, and they're doing an ad for Mouse, which apparently is an apartment manchan seller. Not quite sure how that works. Talent is a big thing. So this is a somewhat older one where, this funny guy is upside down, he's advertising something. Tommy Lee Jones, and from Lost in Translation that foreigners are a big deal. Tommy Lee Jones apparently likes Boss Coffee. I doubt that's true in reality, but we have to ask him. And this is Japan's answer to the Roomba, a very famous actor, a heartthrob, and he has this new Panasonic vacuum cleaner, and so he's a new age man. This is the creativity of Japanese cleaning, and this ad is actually very funny. It ends on the line that you got to feel sorry for the dust, and so not all ads are bad in Japan, right? So this is actually very funny. And then the final thing that we're going to talk about today is, of course, the scandal as an not what it is so much, but as an opportunity, a moment in time. And so the senior executives of Dentsu and Hakuhodo have been indicted. And maybe Andreas can give us a quick update where that stands. But be as it may, what this does is it highlights Dentsu's control position in Japan's ad industry. And so that's basically what we're going to talk about today. So let me stop my share and introduce our speaker. Hey, hello, Andreas Dannenberg. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening to the other side
we're all
of
over the
pond.
place. There are people on the East Coast as well, I think. So let me introduce you quickly. So Andreas Dannenberg is president and CEO of Ad-comm Group, which is an alternative, I don't want to call it boutique, that's too little. It's an alternative ad agency in Japan. Andreas was born in Munich and educated in Germany and the United States. And there's a very interesting story, Andreas, if I remember it correctly. You first hitchhiked or something through China, which you could do by virtue of having a German passport, and Americans couldn't at the time. So your photos, and you're a brilliant photographer, your photos ended up on like sort of title pages in the first sort of China boom in the 80s. And that got you started. It gave you the finance to move to Japan in 1984. When you first worked as a communication consultant for Dentsu. And so you've been inside that building. Then Andreas launched the Ad-comm, which has offices not only in Japan, but also in China. And the main client group, but not the only one, are Japanese multinationals. So he manages brand development and marketing projects for companies such as Suntory, Seiko, Isuzu, DHL, Cartier, Nespresso, Nikon, Lixil, and many more. So welcome, Andreas. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I think these are interesting times, and today's topic is very topical, as in that there may be some changes taking place that may just provide some opportunity for Japanese large multinationals that interestingly sort of the convergence in time, Japanese demographics being as they are, the market gets smaller. Interestingly, there's still about 125, 26 million Japanese, but their consumption is actually dropping faster than the number of people in Japan. And that's simply that about a third are over 65. And by experience, sort of from latest 70 onwards, consumption patterns severely drop. Just people don't need that much anymore. They don't travel as much. They don't need suits for business. So, and of course, they're concerned how long their savings will last. So they become a lot more conservative. So their consumption patterns actually drop much faster than the demographics. Faced with that, Japanese companies, even if you want to stay still, you have to go outside of Japan, with a few exceptions, maybe if you're in or whatever. But other than that, you need to go outside of Japan. Now, those big Japanese companies, they're famous in Japan. So oftentimes they only need to advertise that they have a new product, and guess what? Someone will go out and buy it. And that is what you were referring to earlier, which is the shinhatsubai or shintojo, or something is new. So consumption in Japan has been over decades largely driven by what is something new. And that leads us actually to your opening slide, which are the chindonya. So the chindonya is an interesting phenomenon, depending on what history book you read, but it's at least 150, maybe even older years. And it's a small marching band that ends up gathering in front of a new soba shop or a new garment shop or whatever it was back in the days, make a lot of noise, get attention, people would try it out, and then the business would go on, and they would certainly move on to the next place. So this announcing of something new is particularly driving marketing and sales here, rather than the more strategic brand building, that then there's a very solid base that then new products are being announced upon or launched into the market, but they're part of a much stronger, fundamentally built brand, which is now coming to the fore, with Japanese companies needing to go outside of Japan, where their corporate status or their corporate recognition is not as strong. Japanese in the 70s and 80s were sort of logo brands where from Times Square to Hong Kong Island, you had lots of Japanese logos from whatever Nikon, Canon, Panasonics, car companies. They, if not all, most of them have disappeared by now. Budgets are tighter, things are not going as well. And guess what? It's found out that that on its own is just not strong enough to build a brand, because you may recognize the logo, but you still don't know what it stands for. So this sort of lack of building what it stands for, what, for example, an Apple would stand for, has not helped Japan. And you actually have to reinvest every time in your new product announcements rather than building steadily and building a globally strong brand that people then buy into the brand, and then they buy whatever product is on the shelf or in the showroom. So this basically is linked, if one looks at today's topic, very much into, and these were insights I thought, as you just described. I came to Japan, young man entering Dentsu, and it's like, wow, you've got it made. And sure enough, but when you open the lid, things usually turn out to be different than what you had hoped for or thought it would be. And one of them was definitely that the quality of content of presentations or the strategy didn't really matter. It was, well, we already have whatever, how many spots booked for the next 6 months, or they're indefinitely booked for big, large Japanese companies, and we just need to fill it with creative, which ends up then being the creative, some of which you'd shown, they're just funky and crazy. Some of them are in itself quite creative. Quite often the creatives are not within the Dentsus and Hakuhodos of the world. They're small companies started by former employees or others that are somehow within the universe. Usually they're very captive, so they cannot work. You cannot work for Hakuhodo today and Dentsu tomorrow and 80K the day after. If you're within one universe, you're usually not within the other. Few exceptions always prove the rule, but that is fundamentally how the business is. So they're actually quite captive, and they're fundamentally slave shops. And quite often they don't get to meet the client directly. So your conduit is actually whoever is running the account, which in itself already has, as it usually goes, there's more and more cushions in the communication line, and the briefing gets weaker for that. So first is how much media you've booked, and then you pile in some creative. And the strategy usually gets lost on the way, or it's sort of made up after the fact, which is what I found out. And I thought, gee, Japan needs more than that. But as things here go in Japan, a lot of our viewers are, I'm sure, quite familiar with it. The Japanese corporate environment is very conservative, very risk averse. And I guess in the US, there was also no one gets fired for hiring IBM sort of scenario, that no one gets fired for hiring Dentsu, whether that's good, whether that's helpful. And just now, actually, brands that we see have started to realize that they actually need to become more competitive, and they need to build stronger brands. Now, how does that all tie in with the recent events? It highlights very much on how business is gotten, particularly for Dentsu, but not limited to also the other agencies, because they're all implicated. And it's very much a power play. It's not about the content, it's not about the strategy, but it is how do you politically get and buy yourself one way or another the business. Very surprising for a lot of people, but that's how the business here is run. This was fine as long as there was enough business in Japan, and the overspending by Japanese companies, which I, as a side note, always found spectacular. You would have the big car companies or any big manufacturer trying to save even half a yen on small parts, Those same companies that would switch off half the electricity by unscrewing the neon lights, half each. There's always two here in Japan, and you screw in one, so you reduce the light to save some money, and that may be a good thing. But then you're spending and overspending with communication and advertising. So all of this turning into where now the lid has been taken off, and people are actually, even if you I don't want to believe that. It's actually fundamentally, if you really care to find out, you can find out. But generally, quite often in Japan, people don't want to see reality as it is. So this is now beyond, indictments. Basically, prosecutors only indict when they have a 99% chance of conviction, and I don't expect any different here. And already it's being admitted to by the likes of the CEO of Dentsu. So there's actually quite a big, in that sense, potentially a shift of a recognition, and one cannot deny it anymore that this is the way how business is managed here in the world of advertising in Japan. So potentially, I think there is an opportunity for people to reconsider. You already have, for example, the city of Osaka having blocked Dentsu and Hakuhodo specifically from participating in the expo, which it's huge. It's a big deal. And it actually is to the point, well, who's actually doing it now? So this actually opens opportunities, and I think you will see going forward that it's going to be more difficult. They may be banned from pitching for government contracts, which I think is the right way of sending a signal that these businesses practices are not just not right and not ethical, but they're actually hindering competitiveness of Japan. So maybe I
so let me, so as you know, I study strategy, and I always, if I'm completely honest, I always thought marketing is sort of, serves strategy, right? So we make a strategy, and then we hire a marketing company and they sell it. But in this case, in Japan's case, it seems to be that marketing has been driving strategy in the sense that if shinhatsubai, right, so the new product release is the core message, or is the core means, I guess, or the core lever for selling, then that means that companies have to come up with new products all the time.
That's right. You have, for example, the product development cycles in the automotive industry for fundamental model changes generally is sort of 5 to even 7 years for some companies. In Japan, it's been 2 to 3 years, and every year, even having a facelift on the car. So people always wondered how can you make that? How you can actually get your initial investment back? It's been driven by that the Japanese consumer wanted that, or it was thought that they needed it, but it was fundamentally the underlying issue is a lack of strategy and brand building. Because you need that almost a fix, so to speak, every year, or even for some in the consumer electronics industry, even shorter cycles, where you always needed to announce something new because there was a lack of a bigger reason to buy into a brand.
So basically what you're saying is that because the consumption is declining in Japan even faster than the population, the consumer end product companies have to go abroad, right? And if they want to go abroad, they can't do this shinhatsubai, talento approach. They actually have to have but Japanese companies were very successful in the 1980s. So has anything changed, or did they not need a brand strategy in the days because their products were just so much better? Or how did we get here? Yeah. That this is such a rigid and ossified shinhatsubai market?
Well, this was because the companies were making a lot of money, and quite often they made more money in Japan than outside of Japan. And the reason for that was that their corporate recognition over And a lot of these companies are 100, 200 years old, right? So they're extremely well introduced and known in Japan. And they've also done a lot of outspending and overspending, which if you really were to look at the required costs, they went way overboard. So if you overspend and outspend competitors, this sort of gets you at some point to a strength here. Globally, that was then difficult, and more often than not, they had to drop the price. So, but still, with whether the prices were equal to Japan or not, what has changed over time is the competitive landscape. So back then, for certain products, it was fundamentally only out of Japan. That clearly has changed, whether that's China, Korea, or the other Asian tigers that are producing either own brands. And you see, for example, in Korea, where from Samsung to LG and Hyundai, where strong global brands have been built, that Japan is facing a much more competitive environment. And if you don't have a strong recognized brand, fundamentally, you don't have a lot of things in your arsenal. You just have to drop the price, which is, of course, a game that is very difficult for Japanese companies with the cost structure here in Japan versus.
So that worked in the 80s. It doesn't work anymore.
That's right. Yes.
So what you're talking about, though, is sort of can the Dentsu moment, right? This Olympic moment, if you wish, can the Olympic scandal moment become a moment of change for how Japanese companies view marketing? And my question is about the companies, right? Because you mentioned that they're very risk averse or conservative, or you mentioned several words. So what is the demand for alternative marketing? Are people not really worried that if they put all their eggs into one brand, that this may backfire, or some sort of, I don't know, because Japan's strategy has always been this bara thing, right? So all over the place.
Well, I think it has the potential to start things. You always have sort of seismic moments, pun intended, that actually, during earthquakes, fundamentally things change, or in post earthquakes or natural calamities. The way it almost needs that Daihatsu sort of pressure from the outside that then changes things in Japan. It remains to be seen whether this is big enough. I certainly, for the sake of the success of Japanese companies, that I hope so, that it's a rethink. And it's why I think it's different, that for the first time, it actually is very publicly, it's become a criminal issue, which it never had been before. It's not that it hadn't taken place, but it's now very publicly. And because of the Olympics, it also has a global or international element. It's not just, it's here in Japan and you can pull the rug over it and we're going to be fine. The Olympic issue is quite big. It probably will affect whether the Winter Olympics will go to Hokkaido, and also the sentiment here in Japan. It was quite controversial, the Summer Olympics. First of all, the conviction wasn't as high, for example, as the Olympics before. And then, of course, when it got rammed through in the middle of COVID, fundamentally with massive taxpayer expenses, and no one could fundamentally participate. There were a few hundred people at the opening ceremony, including all the people on the pitch. So it really, Japan's appetite for Olympic Games, I think, has significantly diminished, and this issue is not made it any better. So,
and if I understand it, the taxpayers paid for this graft, right?
That's right. Yes, fundamentally, that's what it is. So, it's a zero-sum game, right? It's got to come from somewhere, and the taxpayers is happily been not happily, I guess, but they got stuck with the bill, and I hope for Japan again that this would be the beginning of something. I'm not holding my breath because it's so deeply rooted that I found out over my years here in Japan. But it may just be the first stone that gets something moving here in Japan.
So let me invite participants to type questions into the Q&A box if you would like Andreas to answer something specifically. And if not, then we'll just continue this conversation, Andreas. So I set us up a little bit with these PowerPoints, but I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about the industry of marketing and the activity of marketing in Japan. So here's a quiz question. Audience, are you ready? I'm going to ask you a quiz question. This is something that I ask my students in class, and it's always interesting because I have many students from Japan in my class. And the quiz question is, what is the Japanese word for marketing department? And so usually the room gets quiet. What is the Japanese for marketing department? And the answer is eigyobu. And eigyobu, of course, would be retranslated into administrative office, right? So Andreas, why do large Japanese companies not traditionally have a marketing department or a specialized marketing team?
Yeah, I guess eigyobu would be, or is also the sort of sales, sales department. But it basically is that sales, or if one looks at, you have R&D. Fundamental R&D, then you have sort of product development, then the product gets made, and then it needs to be sold, and then I guess we should tell everyone, okay, here's the announcement, and that is where the modern day chindonya again comes in, right? So you're just announcing something is new, the shinhatsubai, as we spoke about, comes out. So marketing, when I first came to Japan a few decades ago, there were, I think, all but one professorship for marketing. So marketing traditionally, and unlike certainly sort of the what's considered the West, Europe, US, Australia, and other markets that are somewhat more sophisticated in marketing, or have been traditionally so at least, it is sort of an afterthought. It is more of an announcement. It's not recognized by companies as a strategic role within the overall mix, or within the companies. And only recently marketing has become somewhat more of an importance, but frankly, if I really been seeing how companies operate, it's still an afterthought. That then combined with the very traditional sort of generalist management style here, that people get moved every 2 to 3 years from department to department, i.e. from administration to sales to and then you end up also in marketing, maybe HR. So unless you're an engineer, or let's say a lawyer or an accountant, where you have very specific and professionally trained roles, you get moved around the company, and at some point you end up maybe in the board if you're lucky, and you've been political enough. So that you stay then within the company though, but you get moved around. That means that maybe in your corporate lifetime you end up 2 or 3 times in marketing, usually with at least 10 years in between, where the world, of course, has completely changed. So we are faced with people that are quite often not really specialists. So they're making their decisions not with a historical perspective, with that they have a specialist training or even a degree, and are looking at from a professional angle, but more sort of where their gut feel is. So if their gut feel is good, if they're very smart, if they even have some creative sense, you end up maybe with somewhat better marketing. But then even that good person gets moved away, and guess what? Someone else that doesn't have those natural skill sets then becomes in charge, and all your strategy, your brand strategy goes out the window.
And because they are not specialists. They rely on Dentsu because nobody's ever been fired for hiring IBM or Dentsu, right? So Romain has a question that I actually was going to ask next. So he says, thank you, you're welcome. Could you discuss the relationship between Dentsu and the media companies? And the question that I would have asked you is, how does Dentsu come into this picture, and what kind of company is Dentsu actually?
Yeah, I just quickly to before how do you one important reason how the job is that quite often the children of decision makers in large companies or that are tipped to be will be decision makers on big budgets usually end up working for Dentsu, and so they become a very captive audience. Obviously, dad wants son or daughter to do well, and
is that still true today?
Very much. It's been certainly when I was there, and it to all my indications is still the case that is a defined hiring policy. It's not like anywhere in the world it happens or there's maybe a relationship. This is actually a hiring policy of hiring kids of either existing or potential, that is either company owners, major shareholders. Generations of Toyota CEOs have ended up at Dentsu. So it is a hiring policy. It's very clever, but it has, again, nothing to do with the content of the work. But coming back to it's a very good question on the media. Dentsu is give and take about 125 plus years old in its various reincarnations. And it actually refers to the company that originally sold space in telegraphic sort of newsletters, space for advertisers, and that is really the root of media. And if one looks into pre-war, these were also for government announcements, right? So this was it had sort of a semi-governmental or official role to make announcements, and I guess also propaganda during the war. And after the war, then you had the reborn Dentsu that had a lot of cross shareholding with the media, but also the wire services. So Kyodo and Gigi, they all had I don't know to what extent they currently still have shareholdings, but certainly they were all happy shareholders when Dentsu went public, and that looked very good on their balance sheet, including also the media companies, the big newspaper companies, as maybe some of or most of the audience may know, but there are basically 5 big media slash news groups, the newspaper groups here in Japan. The newspaper was always on top. They then ended up as post Second World War, the TV stations came up. They all had their own TV stations. So you have Yomiuri that owns NTV, Asahi, which is Asahi TV, Mainichi, which is TBS, and Nikkei, which is Tokyo TV and the local network. So you fundamentally have and Fuji TV is Sankei. So these are the groups, and then under those you have radio stations, magazines, etc. So you have fundamentally 5 big media groups in Japan, and they're all linked or have been linked through cross-shareholding, certainly in the early days with Dentsu. So that's sort of, there's a very, even at a shareholder structure, historically, a link to the agency, which again is something that's fundamentally unheard of outside of Japan. So,
I mean, isn't Dentsu itself more of a media company than an advertising company?
Yes, and interesting, you mentioned also the talento. So, of course, with media, you need content, right? And the whole question from Coppola's wonderful sort of Lost in Translation, and again, there was a foreigner, and you have lots of Japanese talentos, and the Japanese talentos, they're raised through talent agencies. So this is quite an integrated, which many of them have been seed invested by Dentsu again. So you create those potential content providing individuals. They then are provided at very low cost to, or even the production of the too many to count stupid game shows that are unfortunately littering the Japanese TV landscape and are sort of mind-numbing. One kind of wonders there's almost a more sinister way of looking at it and dumbing down people and not getting them particularly interested in anything politics or society and arts and culture. So most of them are just really mind-numbing, dumb game shows, and they need to be staffed by talentos. So that's where they get their airtime. And the ones that are either a little more funny or outright sort of weird get more traction, and then they get their advertising contracts, which is where they make the money. And this is then all grown into, you also have Johnny's kind of music promotions and promotion agencies, and they again get all drawn into this. So this is all very cross and interconnected. It's Dentsu is fundamentally making money all on the way, and it's very murky and not very transparent.
So Dentsu has a lid on all of these talento?
Not a lid on all of them, but is involved in many of them, and they certainly, because they're running then the production for the TV companies of the content, those game shows. So you need people in the game shows, you get them from the talento agencies, they then end up getting advertising jobs, and not very clear, but more often than not, Dentsu is involved, and also on the money side. So this is all generating. So from a business model perspective, all respect to it, it's a very highly integrated system. It's unfortunately also very incestuous, and the result of it is the low competitiveness of Japanese companies on the global scale.
So Scott and Ruth have basically the same question going into the internet. So let me read them both. Scott wonders whether the rise of the internet advertising represents more of a threat than an opportunity for these two giants. And Ruth reports that she has in her office a book written by some Dentsu veterans with the title "Advertising and Media Don't Work Anymore," something like that. The argument is that in the age of digital media, the old print and TV branding, basically what you just described, no longer works. So what's the future of this talento thing? And throw in the scandal now that the lid has been opened, right? I mean,
yeah. So absolutely true. I think the onset of digital communication and marketing is a huge challenge that I don't think they've found yet the answer to, the same way they managed to control during the good old TV print media days. And that's simply because the Googles and Facebooks or Metas of the world are very happy to talk to clients directly. And if a client wants to pay a commission to the agency, that's then on top and not taken out of the income of those media platforms. So it's definitely a big challenge. Of course, they're involved. They have reselling. They have, for a lot of the programmatic buying, but nowhere near the same level as in the old days with TV and print media. So there's definitely a structural challenge there. And this, sort of to my earlier point, is all starting to compound. It's not always only one, but I think this is yet another issue that is facing them. And that then in the case of Dentsu, compounded by their, dare I say, maybe not most successful investments in global agency networks. For example, they bought Aegis, by all accounts of industry, probably overpaid by 100%. It was about 5.6 billion or 5.8 billion. And the nearest competitors, Publicis and WPP, had very similarly offered 2.7 billion. So at the time, I thought, this is going to cost them their building. which then incidentally last year they had to sell for exactly that amount, 2.9 billion. They had to sell the building, and they're now renting in their building. So there's a string of things happening. Not any of them individually, but as a totality. I think we're seeing hopefully something that will provide some change overall, and again that will fundamentally be better for Japan if you break it up.
Yeah, it'd be better for Japan. It could be better for Dentsu if they have to be more competitive. It could be better for the industry overall if there is, rather than having these two 800-pound gorillas.
Yeah.
With Dentsu and Hakuhodo, just open it up a little bit and have alternatives. So we're getting some questions on language and global. You mentioned Aegis. So let me start with the language questions. Alexei wonders whether you think that the English language is good at drawing the attention of the Japanese when used in advertising. So is it? I mean, would English advertising work in Japan? Conrad wonders what the alternatives to these advertisements that to Dentsu and Hakuhodo are, right? Do Japanese companies stick to old habits, often due to language concerns, right? So the client wants the omotenashi, that's a bad word now, from Dentsu, and so everybody kind of goes and then stays in the beaten tracks. And so the language thing, I think, is actually very interesting to me. How does that play in, and also into the global strategy?
Well, language, first of all, sad as and to douse all the hopes. Fundamentally, English is still more a sprinkling. It's an accent. It's something just to throw into the mix. But I would not recommend it if one wants to run only English advertising. It will just not get the comprehension simply because as anyone that's been spent a bit of time in Japan, sadly, and again, we go back to what the structural challenges are in Japan, and one of them is clearly still the lack of English language. I mean,
but the same would be true in Germany. I mean, we don't see English ads in Germany.
Yeah, so I don't see English ads any day soon being meaningful. You have sprinklings of words, and it may be sort of cool looking just because from a creative point of view you can do different layouts and fonts, and you can play with that. But fundamentally, it's not. We're not going to see a change to English language in Japanese ads.
Well, I think Alexei might be talking about something slightly different, which is if you want to help your Japanese MNCs to go abroad, right? So if you want to say, okay, Toyota guys, it's time to make the Camry a thing. Or Canon, it's time to make the printer a thing or something, then, or the quality of the printer or whatever. Wouldn't you need a global workforce that can actually do this?
I guess you would need I think these companies and as operations, they are already global. Have they built global brands where Toyota is perceived as the same thing in the US as it is in Europe, as it is in the Middle East, as it is in Africa? Sadly, I would not think so, or just from looking at it, they're very different entities in the perception as a brand. Companies are global. You would need English language, I guess, within those organizations. But if one looks just looking at the boards of Japanese companies and the number of foreigners that are there, it's still very much, and the language spoken at board meetings. I think there's maybe a handful of companies that famously Rakuten Mikitani-san has sort of said from tomorrow it's all in English, but there are very few companies like that have adopted that.
So I guess the question is on Dentsu, right? So we have a question, and I'll read it out. So Dentsu has a large global revenue ratio. It's stated as a fact here, so but the person asks, but I do not feel that there's any actual synergy within Dentsu's group companies. Do you think that they will still remain domestically inclined?
Absolutely. If one looks at the board, if Dentsu were really serious, and I think that is also why the whole Aegis acquisition is is and will in future even more prove very costly, is that they really didn't have an intention to turn into a global agency. Here's our global business and here's our Japanese business. But obviously the Japanese entity is the holding company, the parent. And you see that there's maybe one foreigner on the board. Well, good, but that doesn't make a difference. The board meetings, to my knowledge, are still all in Japanese. So someone needs to translate and interpret, and we all know how challenging that can be and whether there's any actual meaningful and strategic input. Not at those board meetings, but I severely doubt. Also, seeing how the company is behaving I think the influence is minimal.
So the title of our conversation is Beyond Dentsu, and Jeff has a great question that takes us beyond Dentsu. He's asking, so if you are a multinational company that wants to introduce a new product in Japan, okay, what is the best way to go about it? What would you recommend?
I think it would be to run a truly fair and honest competition, to look out, do your homework, try and find alternatives. I think there's also strategic and creative alternatives. And given that the media stranglehold on the media is nowhere near what it used to be by the Dentsus and Hakuhodos, and on top of that, your media mix is likely to be substantially in the digital realm, which is not needing them in the first place. So to really go out and look, it's maybe a little bit more troublesome or professionally challenging, because you have to go and look for the alternatives, but they're certainly there. And I think it would help Japan. It would help certainly the company that is looking to find a break, to look for the alternatives. There are alternatives. Most of them are quite small, just because it's very difficult, or was in the past impossible to grow bigger in the face of any of the big accounts ended up politically being given to either Dentsu or Hakuhodo. And by non-fair means of competition, that definitely has to be said. And I think as a multinational, you have all the power. You don't have to. And if you make sure that your local employees are sharing your sort of fair competition mindset, if that is properly and fairly run, you actually will be finding very surprising and great alternatives.
So you mentioned Hakuhodo, and we never talk about it. I'm wondering, well, sometimes we do, but not as much as we talk about Dentsu. And I'm wondering whether that's similar to Walmart and Target in the United States. There once was an article that started with a line, if it were, so every MBA student in the United States has to study the Walmart case because they are the low price leader. But the article started with the line, if it weren't for Walmart, everybody in every MBA in the United States would be studying Target, because they're sort of the quiet number two, just basically doing the exact same thing, right?
Yeah.
Is that true here too? That if we weren't talking about Dentsu, we would all be up in arms on whatever we are, in admiration, I guess, of Hakuhodo.
Yeah, I mean, Dentsu is sort of first of all historically the longer company, and in different incarnations, and for all intents and purposes, it's fundamentally been many different companies. It's just that there's sort of a traceable link to them. Hakuhodo was then established to be, I guess, an alternative, but as it often happens, you kind of end up mimicking, because this, your number one is so big, and however success is defined, but if you look at sales, I guess if that then is if that's deemed successful, so you emulate what the number one does, and you end up being the smaller version of number one. So they're plus minus. They've then sort of scooped up the media house agency. So Yomiuri from the Yomiuri newspaper group, they ended up being with Hakuhodo, and same for Daiko and Asahi Advertising. So they all were migrated into Hakuhodo and sort of make up for plus minus half of the size of Dentsu. So, but it's fundamentally, more of the same. Of course, some people within Hakuhodo, I'm sure, would beg to differ. But if you look at how things are run, and also the output of it is not a lot of difference, frankly.
So this goes back to maybe an earlier conversation, part of the conversation, but we have questions. So let me ask Tammy and Olga both. I'm wondering about social media. How large is the social media ad segment? And wouldn't influencers play major roles in Japanese marketing? Because the talento, so the logical extension of today's talento on TV is the influencer on YouTube, right?
Yes, exactly. So you have that, and you also have the talento or influencer agencies, which again, sort of, as you already suggest, they try to take a page out of what is or had been a successful book. So that then, as sadly in the digital space where everyone thinks data is everything, but if the data are manipulated and not really reflecting the actual influence in the market, then of course that becomes a lot more of a challenging thing, but definitely important, as especially the younger generations are not on the TV screen. The TV may be still running in the back. And something else that a lot of people don't know, there's a company called Video Research that fundamentally sets all the pricing for all the TV commercials. There are only a few hundred homes in Japan, which statistically is sort of in the nonsense realm, but it's the only company that actually evaluates viewership, and that's fundamentally motion sensors. So we don't know if it was the cat, if it was the baby, if it was Granny or the teenage daughter that moved in front of the TV. So what's recorded is what channel was on, and whether someone was supposedly viewing it. But if your eyes are on your smartphone, the TV then becomes a BGM that only if whatever, some mega accident or scandal or something occurs, you kind of look for a few minutes. If the next talento gets arrested for some drug use or being caught in the wrong place with the wrong person or whatever, you kind of look up and then you're straight back to your phone, if at all. So yes, the TV may be still there, but is it actually viewed is a whole different question. And yes, your influencers are important, but the question then, what influencers to hire? And I think there will be a lot of optimization. We've actually developed one program where we qualify influencers, which is very interesting.
So Olga has a question where I first thought, I'm not sure about this question. And then I'm thinking, this is super interesting. What she's wondering is to what extent are Japanese consumers ethnocentric? Do they prefer local or global brands on a broad scale, if it's possible to generalize? And at first I thought, well, yeah, of course they like Japanese brands. But then I realized, no, there's this whole luxury market segment that is very much driven by foreign products, right? Yes,
very much driven by foreign products that, again, have just been a lot better at marketing. You have watch companies in Japan that are trying to build a luxury or premium watch brand, but at the same time are selling their products in the discount shops in Shinjuku or whatever. And that again, it's if you are strategic in your marketing approach, then that would just not happen, and the luxury firms are not. If you find something, it's a fake, but that has become a lot more difficult to sell in Japan. So you just don't find luxury brands there, if you have to make up your mind. But then the sales department comes in and says, yeah, but we could have some extra sales in whatever Don Quixote or Big Camera or whatever they may be. So if you then cave in as a company and you go and you take those sales, you're paying for it by not being recognized as a premium or luxury brand. So you're absolutely correct on that. And I think another interesting case again is Apple, that has sort of, whilst not being a luxury brand, but they're certainly in the premium price segment and absolutely continue to be loved by Japanese. So if your product is right, if your product is in that sense, in actuality or certainly in perception superior to Japanese products, the rewards are very high.
All right, so I'm looking at the clock and it's time to wrap up. We have one more question that actually gets us to that, which is, do you think Dentsu's dominant position in the industry will continue for the next 10 years? And so let me rephrase that into the standard question that I always ask. What, in your view, is the worst case scenario that could come out of this moment of crisis, right? And what is the silver lining from this moment of, if it is a moment of crisis?
Yep, it's as the eternal optimist, I certainly hope that this is sort of the one moment that, in addition to all the other things that are the shifts and changes in the industry, will provide that. I certainly hope that Dentsu is not the dominant position for the sake of Japan, for the sake of survival of Japanese brands, and even building and becoming more globally competitive. But again, I'm not holding my breath. Japan has proven to, in the face of clear evidence, would still go the other way, just because that's how we've always done it, and they will only change when the pain level is very high. And Japan, though, unfortunately, has a very high propensity for gaman, for sticking with things. But this one may just provide to be an interesting opportunity for Japan to change. Well,
but if all the kids of the important people work at Dentsu, then
yeah,
there's a built-in stabilizer right there, right?
That may well be the case, but hey, as an eternal optimist, otherwise you wouldn't start a company in Japan. So.
Right. So what is the best case scenario that you see for Japanese companies? Not so much the ad industry, but Japanese economy overall, because you're making a larger point that this is not just about marketing, right? That this is about the competitiveness of the global competitiveness of large Japanese companies. So the Dentsu is one story, and we talked maybe too much about it. But the patient, or if you wish, is the competitiveness or the large companies that have to sell abroad.
The ideal case scenario would be to elevate marketing and brand building as a very strategically important part of the mix of corporate activities, to elevate it to that, to invest in people, educate them so that they actually become very knowledgeable professionals, and doing that across industries, because the fact is that Japanese companies have very, very competitive and very good products. And unfortunately, more often than not, they're sold below their actual value, compared certainly with other products. So one really stands to hope that those companies elevate that, expect then from, and whatever they may be, the Dentsus or Hakuhodos of the world, expect a much more professional content and strategic approach, and that then overall, and if it's not good enough, they will go somewhere else, rather than, well, it's not great, but what can I do? I stay with Dentsu, to actually be demanding for the best that they can get for their money, and that will make a real difference.
The power of the sophisticated consumer.
That's right.
It is a very powerful and long established force yeah. So thank you, Andreas. I learned something fundamentally that I will use in teaching. I'm telling my students by asking them, why is the SGA over sales ratio so high for Japanese companies? And as we know, SGA, sales, general administrative, and it includes marketing. And yeah. I always thought that SGA over sales was high in Japan because of lifetime employment. But you just added that the marketing portion of that ratio is also higher than maybe
then it should be. Yes, absolutely.
That it should be, or even compared with other countries. So I have to go back and look at that ratio again.
Quality. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much. This was wonderful. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. It was great to have you, and thanks for the great questions. In 2 weeks, we'll be back and we talk about politics. So we're switching around all the time, right? So we're going back to politics in the South China Sea before we have some fun sailing around Japan. So stay with us. Keep your eyes open for our mailers, and stay safe and well. Wish you all a wonderful spring. So thank you, Andreas Dannenberg, for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.